and welcome to Big Questions. I'm Tabby from the Christian Union, and today I'm really delighted to introduce Robbie Strachan, a pastor from a church in central Cambridge, who will be speaking to us on the question, what difference does the Bible make to people? After a 25-minute talk, there'll be a 10-minute Q&A, so during his talk, please do feel free to submit any questions that you have using the Google form, which is linked in the comment section. So now enjoy the talk, and I'll hand over to Robbie.
Oh, well, hi friends, it's lovely to be with you. Thanks for the invitation from the Cambridge Christian Union. I work at one of the churches in Cambridge. My name is Robbie. I live here too. Can I just say though, in this lockdown time, it's pretty boring being in Cambridge without the students. We're missing you guys. And it must be weird for you to do term at home and stuff. It's weird for us too. We can't wait to have you back. We're going to be thinking a bit about the whole question, what difference does the Bible make to people? Now, there's no doubt that this book is one of the most important and influential books of all time. It's been translated into over 2,000 languages. It's sold over 5 billion copies, in spite of the fact that around the world, it's actually pretty controversial and even illegal in some countries. It's a book that people for the last 2,000 years have read and cherished and loved and found influential and important in their lives. And I guess in part because it has been read by so many different people, it has made a huge difference to whole swathes of Western civilization, and it still does today. I mean, I could talk about William Wilberforce or Mother Teresa or Martin Luther King. Like, most people know that their the Bible was a huge source of inspiration for them and their thinking, and it profoundly shaped how they viewed the whole concept of slavery or race or poverty. And there are countless others, less well-known Christians whose social projects have been influenced by this book. Think about women's education or human trafficking or homelessness projects or affordable housing or whatever. The list could go on. I've been enjoying recently this book, I don't know if you've seen it, by a guy called Tom Holland. It's called Dominion, and in it he tells the story of modern Western liberal world, the world that we live in, and shows how, surprisingly, even though we like to think of ourselves as secular, non-religious age, many of our instincts and values are inescapably influenced by the Bible. Things we take for granted, like the idea that all human life has equal value, or that it is nobler to sacrifice and suffer than it is to inflict suffering on others, or that we should love and respect everybody. Tom Holland says these are ideas that are not from Roman or Greek thought, or even from the Enlightenment humanist thought. They come from the Bible. But as well as the huge impact on civilization and the Western world, this book makes a difference to individuals. So I read recently the story of a guy called Mark Shepard, who's the assistant professor of public policy at Harvard University. He grew up in a kind of culturally Jewish background, but basically, when he went to Harvard as an undergraduate, he was an atheist. But while studying there, he slowly began to question whether atheism could provide a foundation for him of moral truth. His parents had raised him with a strong sense of kind of right and wrong, and he knew after the 9/11 kind of attacks in America, the question of objective good and evil was really, really important. But he also knew that rationally, if there was no God or no ultimate purpose to the universe, then right and wrong with subjective preferences. Sure, people could agree and we could kind of have general consensus, but at the end of the day, they're just subjective. He read the Bible and was blown away. Here's what he says in his own words. Here was the most beautiful, powerful expression of moral truth I'd ever encountered. But who did this come from? Could this really be the work of a poor Jewish carpenter and his uneducated followers? As he read on and discussed the Bible a bit more with friends at Harvard, he became persuaded that perhaps he'd misunderstood this book and the person at the heart of it for the whole time. Or another story that I heard of a student at Oxford University. He wrote, "When I came to Oxford, I never really considered that Jesus might be actually what he said he was. I was an atheist. But during my degree, I began to realise I needed help. By the start of my second year, I was trying to deal with poor mental health and significant self-loathing. I started questioning who I was and realised I was broken, selfish, and increasingly becoming a person I didn't want to become. I had loads of great support and family and friends that loved me, but I was still slipping into a dark place. What on earth did I need more?" He writes. He read the Bible. And in the Bible, he says, he found a God who it describes as loving, and who wants to save us from suffering so much that he gave his one and only Son, that whoever believes in him shall not only not perish, but have eternal life. And he wrote, this student, I knew I was broken and needed help, and I began to realise that God was the only solution. The Bible has a profound impact on individuals too. It gives meaning and purpose and morality to life. It gives joy in darkness and in suffering. So why is it? What's all the fuss about this book? What explains the Bible's relevance? Well, it is not just that it tells a beautiful story, although it does. Many think the Bible is like just a list of laws, or perhaps like an encyclopedia. If you want to find out about God and stuff, you can go there. It's got lots and lots of pages, but you're not really going to read all of it, and it's not that enjoyable. Others think, oh, it's a kind of history of religion. But it's not any of those things. In fact, it's a unified story. It's told over many, many years, and there are 66 different books, countless different authors, lots of different genres too. But even though it's written over that long period of time, it tells a remarkably unified story. It begins with a beautiful mind, a being called God, who has the power to bring order out of chaos and to bring something out of nothing. And it pictures the world that God makes as this beautiful garden, a garden full of life. And into this garden, God places creatures called humanity, or in Hebrew, Adam. It says these creatures are made in God's image. They'll care and tend for this garden that he's made. They've been given power by God to do good in the world, but they also face a choice. It's represented in the garden by a tree. They could partner with God and choose to obey him and join him in this great project of life, or they could choose their own way to disobey, to define good and evil on their own terms and seize power for themselves. And God says if that's the option, then it leads to death. Now the humans hear this voice, this other voice in the garden, the dark and mysterious creature, who says the choice is simple. Take the fruit, then you'll really be free. And so they do. And as a result, they become suspicious of one another and violent and selfish and protective. And it leads humanity down this dark path of brokenness and death, just like God said it would. Fractured relationships with this beautiful world that God has made, with one another, and ultimately with the God who made them. But in my Bible, that just gets us to page 6. The rest of the Bible is more of that incredible story, a story of God's loving project of recreating this broken world and restoring the broken relationships that humanity has brought upon themselves, that relationship with him in particular. The Old Testament focuses on just one ethnic group, the Jews, who through tons of ups and downs experienced this kind of project of God's love in a whole bunch of different ways. But it becomes clear pretty early on that by focusing on this particular people group, it's actually part of God's plan to restore the whole globe and deal with humanity's deepest problem. Eventually, the story focuses on this one Jewish person, Jesus of Nazareth. That's what the New Testament is all about. We've had glimpses of, through the Old Testament, a person who would come to restore everything. In Jesus, God does something surprising and radical. Jesus hears the same dark, mysterious voice, but this time he doesn't give in. He also faces brokenness and death and actually willingly dies. But this time it's so that life can be restored. Jesus' story is the ultimate story of love, betrayal, and sacrifice. And it's so important that actually in the Bible you get it 4 times. That's the 4 Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. The rest of the New Testament is basically the story of the early Jesus movement, followers of Jesus, and actually mainly their letters to each other from prison. And it ends with this vision of another garden, the world made new. Actually, it's more like a garden city. All nations, people from every tribe and tongue are there. And Jesus is there. Now, this narrative arc, okay, this story is beautiful, and it's inspired countless plot lines in literature or in cinema or whatever. And some of the poetry and prose that makes up this story has made its way into English language just in everyday phrases. It's clearly had a huge influence. But I reckon that's not the most important thing about this book. So it's not that it's a beautiful story, it's not also that it asks and answers some of the most important questions that humans ask. Although again, it does do that. This is a book that touches on some of the most fundamental things about humanity. It's full of characters you can relate to. People with doubts and flaws and foibles. People who've experienced loss and suffering and hopelessness. In fact, there's a whole book of the Bible that's a reflection on the pointlessness of life. Meaningless, meaningless. Everything is meaningless. I bet you didn't know that was a quote from the Bible. One of the things you really get as you read through it is just how realistic it is about the human experience. Is there any hope for the world? Where do we come from? What is right and wrong? How are we to treat each other? Why is the world so broken? Is there anything I can do to fix it? These are questions that humans have been asking for millennia. They're some of the most basic and fundamental questions to all human life, and the Bible addresses them. Actually, I don't think you can really function in life without answers to these questions. For many people, they're just assumed, right? They're the kind of things that your parents believed, so you believe, or the things that your culture around you believes, that's what you'll believe are the answers to those questions. It's funny though how sometimes in moments of big crisis, we're forced to face up to those questions again. It's interesting, Bible app downloads in the month of March went up globally. It's the same with physical Bibles. According to one bookshop, the sale of physical Bibles last month went up by 50%. People are searching for answers to those big fundamental questions of life. COVID-19 shakes our foundations and forces us to revisit some of those perennial human questions. And the Bible does claim to answer them. I don't know if you've heard of Lee Mack. He's a British comedian. And recently he was interviewed on the radio show Desert Island Discs. Desert Island Discs is kind of like you get a famous person and you kind of imagine that they're on a desert island and you ask them all sorts of things that they would bring to the desert island, particularly their favourite albums and tracks and stuff like that. And you also ask them what book they would like. But every person on the show is kind of theoretically given the Bible and all the works of Shakespeare, because if you said those two things, right, you'd be kind of a boring person, that you'd actually want them on a desert island. You want to find out a bit more about the person than just whether they want to read those two things. But Lee Mack actually interesting. I mean, like for most people, you just kind of move on at that point. But Lee Mack stopped and said, you know what, actually, I'm really glad that on this desert island I would have the Bible, because I would actually read it. I think it's quite odd that people, myself, he says, are quite happy to dismiss the Bible, but they've never read it. And then he kind of has this analogy. He says, imagine that an alien came to Earth and you were the only person they ever meet. And they said, okay, well, what is life all about? You know, what's Earth about? What's the meaning of it? Tell us everything. And you say, well, I don't really know, but there is this book that, you know, claims to have all the answers. And the alien says, well, brilliant, like tell me all about the book. Like, have you read it? It's like, well, no, I've not read it. I've never read it. It'd be such a weird thing, wouldn't it? And he concludes, at the very least, read it. Now, the Bible does answer and ask some of those perennial human questions, and it has offered to many unique and enduring answers that people have found to be deeply satisfying, and it's a brilliant and compelling reason to read it for yourself. But again, I don't think that is the reason why it is so influential and why it has such an impact on people. As we finish, here's the big thing, the big reason why I think the Bible makes such a difference to people. It's because in this book, God speaks. Now, that takes a bit of unpacking. What does that actually mean? It's a big claim, but it's actually not that weird that God would want to speak, and even that he'd speak in a book. Communication is key to any relationship, right? I mean, imagine a couple that just never speak to each other. That kind of relationship would be dead. As I mentioned earlier, the Bible is one unified story, and actually the way that it begins is with God speaking. So you open the first page of the Bible and you read, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth, and God said, let there be light. That's how he makes everything. 10 times in Genesis chapter 1, God speaks. Now, I'm not trying to get stuck here by debates about creation or 7 days or whatever, or evolution. I think chapter 1 is meant to be a poem. But it's so significant then that poetically it describes the creation of the world by God speaking. Right from the beginning, this is a claim about what God is like. Yes, he is the God who made everything, but he's also a God who made things by communication. He's the God who invented language. And doesn't just that just say that he's a God who wants relationship? It's a good thing that he's like this, because I guess without any kind of speaking or any kind of coming forward on his part, how could we know anything about him? It's like being stuck in a cave and just looking at the shadows on the wall of the world outside. God is a communicating and speaking God. So we should expect that he wants to somehow speak and communicate to us. And that is exactly what you get when you come to the person of Jesus as well. So another beginning, in another book of the Bible, John chapter 1 this time, it begins in a pretty similar way to Genesis chapter 1, right at the beginning of the Bible. And perhaps the author's trying to make a point. In the beginning, this time, was the Word. And the Word was with God, and the Word was God. He was with God in the beginning. Through him all things were made. Without him nothing was made that has been made. See what he's saying? He's kind of going back to that Genesis 1 thing and saying, in the beginning was the Word. That's how God made everything. But it is astonishing then what comes next. The Word became flesh and made his dwelling among us. The claim in John's Gospel is that the God who spoke the world into existence became human to communicate his love for us. The author Becky Pippert talks about a time in her journey from atheism to Christianity as a young adult when she spent some time in the garden and she was looking at an ant's nest. And she marveled at how the things that she did to this nest, like putting a stick down or a leaf or whatever, could change the whole course of the ant's life, and they wouldn't even know that it was her. And she started thinking, like, what would I have to do in order to communicate to these ants that I existed? She's trying to think about it, like, how could an ant even comprehend the existence of a person? And she eventually realised what I'd need to do was actually become an ant. Like, I'd have to become an ant and go down and kind of tell them what I'm like and stuff like that. And then suddenly it dawned on her, and remember at this point she's an atheist, that is exactly the claim that Christians make about God. How could he communicate to us that he loves us? How could he communicate that he wants a relationship with us? Well, he would have to come and in the person of his son. He'd have to come down as a human. And according to the Bible, that is exactly what happens. It's why actually the Bible really focuses on the person of Jesus. All of the Old Testament points forward to this coming one, and all of the New Testament looks back to what he has done. God comes and communicates in the flesh. But it's not just that he communicates. Flesh is a very deliberate word. It's meaty and kind of raw. We get the word incarnation. It's the same kind of Latin word as carne, chili con carne, kind of meat with chili. The thing about flesh is that flesh knows suffering and pain. Flesh knows what it's like to die. And that is exactly what Jesus does to bring us into a relationship with him. This is words in action, not just communication, but communication that changes people. And I think that is why the Bible is so profoundly influential on all sorts of different people. A God who wants to communicate to us and have a relationship with us, like a father and a son is kind of the image that is used in the Bible, or a mother and a daughter. And you know what sons and daughters are like? Well, they're loved and secure. It means they can face ups and downs through life, like the story of that student from Oxford. It means they eventually become like their parents. Now, for most of us, that might not be such a great thing. But if God is the Father, then it means they'll be generous and kind and loving. And I guess that's what explains Wilberforce and Luther King and all those others. This is why it makes such a big difference to people. In this book, God is seeking a relationship with you. He loves you, and he wants to change you. Now, look, I'm not saying that this book by itself is going to change you, okay? Plenty of people can read this book from start to finish and actually miss the main character, Jesus himself. I've offered, though, 3 reasons why I think the Bible has such an influence on people. It's a beautiful and compelling story. It asks and answers some of the most fundamental questions of human life and experience. And those 2 alone are reasons to give it a read. Particularly if you're an English or a history student or an art subject student, or if you've just got a general interest in the history of Western civilization. But the 3rd reason is a game changer. The claim is that if you read this book, you will hear the very words of the God who made everything. An encounter with this book and with these words is an encounter with the God who spoke them. At the end of John's Gospel, the writer, John, as he closes his eyewitness account of Jesus' life, said, "These things are written so that you may have life." Just to finish, I would strongly recommend giving the Bible a read if you've never done it before as a kind of thinking adult. I'm sure someone in the Christian Union or a friend of yours from college who's a Christian would absolutely love to read a bit of the Bible with you. Why don't you just ask them? I think what's going to happen now is that there's a chance to ask some questions. There's a Google form to fill in, and I'll be live trying to answer some of the questions that you guys send in. Thanks so much for listening. It's the next day. I recorded that talk yesterday, so thanks so much for listening to it, and thanks for some of the great questions that have come in already. Feel free to keep sending them in. Hopefully the plan over the next 10 or 15 minutes is to try and answer some of them, and yeah, we'll see what we do. We'll see what we can do. Let's first of all, though, give a massive shout out to some of the KitQ tech guys who are working behind the scenes on their computers and stuff, doing a fantastic job of making sure this all goes live. It's actually quite hard to do live streaming stuff like this from lots of different parts of the country. So fair play to those guys. Thanks, everybody. A couple of questions have come in. The first one is this one. There are lots of books, particularly holy books, that would claim to answer all those questions as well. I guess the questions of the meaning of life and the kind of purpose of life and where we come from and all that kind of stuff. Why should I read the Bible and not others? Well, it's a really good question. And first of all, let me just say, I'm not saying that you shouldn't read other books. I think that would be a pretty arrogant thing to say, to just kind of ignore, say, the Quran or the Bhagavad Gita or some other kind of huge text that might claim to answer some of those same questions. I hope that as you're coming to this talk, you're the kind of person who's interested in ideas and kind of debating and discussing, and I think Christians are like that too. But I guess what I am saying is read those books and look to compare and contrast what they're saying about the answers to those questions, because it's one of the most offensive things actually to any religious person to say, well, yeah, all just religions, they're all the same. They're basically all just the same way of dealing with the same problems. That is not true at all. There's a lot of very different and diverse kind of readings and answers to some of those questions that we posed. I guess the second thing that I'd say is that actually that's why I said it wasn't the most important reason why the Bible is so relevant and significant. I mean, it is true that the Bible answers and claims to answer some of these questions, but lots and lots of books are like that. the thing that makes the Bible as a holy book stand out, kind of compared to some of the other holy books around there in some of the major world religions, is the person right at the heart of it. Yeah, they all claim to be about God, but Christianity and the Bible is the only book that claims that God himself has not only spoken, but come down in the person of his Son. And I guess that is the main reason why Christians believe that the Bible is the Word of God, because that's how Jesus treats the Old Testament and the New Testament. Sometimes you hear this kind of accusation against holy books or the Bible or whatever, like, oh, it's all just circular. You kind of believe that's God speaking because it says that it's God speaking, so that's a circular argument. But the historical person of Jesus breaks right through that circle. He is the one who claims to be the truth from God, not just the truth from God, but God himself. And actually that's quite different from other religious books, and you can go and read them. The Quran is a collection of kind of dreams and sayings that Muhammad received in a cave from God himself. It's not a story that's written over thousands of years like the Bible is. It actually makes quite a different kind of claim. And then there's kind of other writings in Islam that are more kind of sayings of the Prophet or kind of rules and things like that. And of course, like I said, the Bible does contain some rules like that. But actually, it's this unique and beautiful overarching story that tells one story from beginning to end of God's dealings with humanity. I guess the Torah, the Jewish books, well, actually, they're in the Bible. They're the kind of the Jewish Old Testament, the Christian Old Testament. So I guess the thing to say about this question of other religions is, well, by all means, contrast and compare. Don't assume they're going to be the same, because actually there's some pretty striking differences. And notice, I think, when it comes to Christianity, the biggest difference, that it's not just the claim that God has kind of somehow shown a human being what he's like, but that he has come in the person of a human being, the Word become flesh. And see what you think of the answers that Christianity gives to some of those age-old questions. Thanks for that one. It was a really, really good one. There's lots of other books. Can I just, on that one, give a bit of a plug for a speaker that was at the Big Questions a couple of weeks ago, Rebecca McLaughlin. She's written a brilliant book, and actually there's a whole chapter in that book called Confronting Christianity. There's a whole chapter in there where she tackles this question: what about other religions? Is it arrogant and exclusive to believe that Jesus is the only way? Like, what does Christianity do to other religions? Her chapter in that is absolutely brilliant, and you can just get it on Amazon. Just search, like, later or whatever on another tab, Confronting Christianity, Rebecca McLaughlin. Okay, that's one of the questions that came in. Please keep sending more if you'd like to. Here's another one. And this is a very good question. There are many different ways people read the Bible, symbolically, literally. How do we know which interpretation is correct? And let me just scroll over. What impact does this have on what Christians believe? Yeah, well, it obviously has a very big impact on what Christians believe. If you kind of interpret the whole Bible as some kind of strange dream that somebody had that actually has no bearing on reality, then you might say that you're somebody who reads the Bible, but you're not going to act and kind of live in the same way that lots of Christians throughout history have done. So the way that you interpret the Bible is really going to kind of change and shape the kind of Christianity or what you do in response to what is written. And I guess the question then, how do you have a right interpretation, is going to be really important. In fact, actually, the Bible itself talks about this. It talks about people being able to rightly handle the word of truth. It talks about kind of being wary of people who will twist and manipulate the Bible. And it's actually very easy to do that. I guess one of the things that's going to help us in answering this question is thinking a bit about what the Bible is. And I mentioned that there's several different genres and kind of ways of writing. Some things that are very much narrative, like story, or kind of telling a story of a particular people, or there's things that are much more poetic. There's a lot of poetry in the Bible. And then there's things that are more, I guess the technical word would be kind of prose discourse, things like letters or lists or laws or whatever. And those different genres of the Bible are going to need to be read in slightly different ways. I mean, we're used to that idea. Even if you don't study English and you're a STEM student or whatever, you're used to the idea of reading a recipe book and a magazine article and the instructions for your new computer and a novel in really different ways. And helping to understand a little bit about what kind of genre the Bible is written in will help us with this question of interpretation. So take, for example, the thing that I mentioned, Genesis chapter 1, which describes the creation of the world. Now I think actually that this is written in a very beautiful and highly stylized form of poetry. There's the 7 days, right? And in the first 3 days, God makes the kind of spaces, which in the final 3 days, he then fills. So, he makes the kind of the sky and fills it with the moon and the sun. And you think, well, that doesn't make sense scientifically, because how could you have a world created and a sky created when there's actually no sun already? Like, he's already created the world before he then creates the sun. That doesn't make any sense. But we're not supposed to read that as a scientific textbook. I think we're supposed to read it as somebody who both shapes and then lovingly fills the world that he makes. It's a kind of description more of what God is, of the reality that God has created the world and what he is like, than it is a kind of description of the scientific process through which you do that, I think. So you see how their genre shapes our interpretation of that. And I guess that's just the hard work of reading the Bible. Like any book, you need to work hard on kind of what does it say, why does it say it, what's some of the context within the book as a whole, within the Bible, because actually the Bible writers, later ones, write very conscious of the earlier writings, and there's a lot of what the kind of posh word for this is intertextuality, a lot of kind of references back and forth in the Bible itself. And I guess we also need some kind of awareness of historical context too. So when kind of a New Testament writer refers to a centurion or a cross, we need to know what those things are. And we do, because of historical archaeological evidence and that kind of stuff. So yeah, we need to be careful Bible readers. But I think there's one more thing when it comes to lots of different ways of reading the Bible. And that is actually, if the Bible is God speaking, then when we come to read it, there's also a moral imperative when it comes to interpretation. Now, hear me out on this one, because it might sound a little bit strange. But imagine that somebody writes a letter to you, which you just automatically assume is always going to be a lie. That shows something about the relationship that you have with that person, doesn't it? Or imagine you receive a letter from Boris Johnson. In fact, every household did receive a letter from Boris Johnson in the last few weeks that said, stay at home. Like, everybody needs to stay at home to protect kind of lives and save lives and kind of help the NHS not be overloaded and stuff like that. Imagine you received that letter and immediately scrunched it up and threw it in the bin. Again, it would show something about your moral attitude towards the person who sent it, Boris. And, Boris, whether you like him or whether you hate him or love him, he is Prime Minister and he does get to decide things like that and send you letters like that. And I guess there's a similar moral thing when it comes to the Bible, except that the person who stands behind the Bible, the person who speaks through it and in it, is the creator of the whole universe. So there's a sense in which one of the most important things when it comes to interpreting the Bible is that we come humbly, that we come, I don't know, perhaps ready to be disagreed with. Now, that might not be a very comfortable thing. I think, and particularly Cambridge University students, will read the Bible, whether they're Christians or non-Christians, and they'll sit over it and think, well, I don't like that bit and I don't like that bit, but I do like that bit, and kind of make a judgment. But if it is what we've said it is, then to correctly interpret the Bible means that we need to come with some kind of moral and humble approach. And God is the one who gets to define what that morality is, because, he made everything. So yeah, there are lots of different ways in which people read the Bible, and whether you take things symbolically or literally or whatever very much depends on genre. And there's some hard work involved. But there's also that kind of moral way of reading, that actually one of the most important things as we come to the Bible is to think, goodness, could this really be from God? And if it is, then what should my attitude to it be? One more question that's come in. How do I know that God is speaking to me and not the first apostles who wrote the New Testament? Well, actually, there's a really brilliant little verse. I've got my Bible just here. If you don't mind me finding it, I'll flick to it in, I think, the book of Romans, which says, oh man, sorry, I'm not going to be able to quite find it because I can't quite remember where it is. Tell you what, if you don't know where to find something, you can just Google it. So that's exactly what I'm going to do right now. Just bear with me. Basically, what it's saying is the Old Testament and the New Testament are written for the benefit of God's people, and that's, I guess, how the New Testament understands what Scripture is. It's something that's beneficial for kind of all of God's people. And I guess the reason why the New Testament writers think that is because they don't believe that God has just left them on their own. So God, the Father, sends his Son in Jesus, who dies and rises from the grave, and then is ascended into heaven. But one of the things that Jesus says before he goes is, I'm not going to leave you on my own. I'm going to send God the Holy Spirit to come and be with you. And it's really interesting in all the ways, in the kind of big section where Jesus talks about what this Spirit is going to be like and what's going to do, what he's going to do. He talks about how the Spirit will remind them of the things that he's taught and help them to keep teaching and sharing what he's taught with others so that it will bless and benefit others. So I guess you could say that God sets it up in such a way that even though Jesus only came once at one time in history, in space and time in history, actually his life and his death and his resurrection and the writings about them are going to be beneficial for many people. Now, of course, the New Testament letters are not written to you. Like Paul did not sit down and write to Jenny or whatever, who lives in kind of Huddersfield but goes to university in Cambridge in the letter to the Romans. He didn't. He wrote to the Romans. So I guess we have to remember that those things are written not to us, but they are written for us. And I guess Christians trust and believe that because we believe that God is the one who is ultimately in control, who sent his Son. And then after his Son, sent his Spirit to help us understand those things that have been read. And actually, it's a really cool thing, isn't it? I remember thinking about this a bit when I was a student at university, trying to work out kind of how could I know what God is like? Kind of like Rebecca McLaughlin and that kind of, sorry, not Rebecca McLaughlin, the other one I mentioned, Becky Pippert, and that ant analogy. How could I know what God was like if there's this historical distance between me and Jesus Christ? I'm not. How could I believe that? I studied history at university, and it's all about the sources, and you kind of think, well, what's going on? Why can't I get access to better sources about Jesus? I'd rather have video, or I'd rather have a camera footage, or I'd even just rather meet him in person. But actually, if you think about it, like having something that is written down and carefully and meticulously kind of handed on from one generation to another, and that actually comes within a whole religious framework, the Jewish framework, where writing things down is super important, and scribes would kind of carefully copy everything. It's actually a quite good way of communicating truth that's going to endure, communicating things that are going to endure. Someone very kindly has just sent me the verse that I was looking for. Thank you so much. It's Romans chapter 15 and verse 4. For everything that was written in the past was written to teach us, so that through the endurance taught in the Scriptures and the encouragement they provide, we might have hope. And just as we close, that is an amazing kind of picture of what God is like. He is powerful and sovereign and in control because he made the universe. But he's also the kind of God that carefully kind of plans it out so that for you and for me, living in 21st century Britain, we can have access to what he's like because it's been handed over and handed on in the Bible. That's kind of how he's set it up by the sovereign work of his Holy Spirit. So I think that's pretty cool, really. And I think it shows something about what God is like. I think that pretty much brings us to the end of our questions. Can I just say one more time that it's been really lovely to be with you. Thank you so much for having me, and I hope you've enjoyed this. And if you're watching kind of recorded, then I'm sorry that you didn't get a chance to send your question in or whatever. But you can still do that. I think the Google form will probably still be open, and I'd love to be in touch if you do have any more questions. I'm going to hand back to Tabby now. Thanks.
Thanks so much, Robbie. You've given us lots of food for thought. If Robbie's talk has thrown up any questions for you and you'd like to hear from a Christian Cambridge student about what the Bible means to them, then there's an option at the end of the Google form to leave your CRS ID, and a member of the Christian Union will get in touch with you to share what the Bible means to them and what difference it makes in their life. So yeah, check out the Q&A Google form for that. And next week we'll be back to hear from Matt Lillycrap on the question, is prayer an empty comfort? So I really hope to see you all then, and I hope you have a good week in the meantime. Goodbye.